Welcome to the Half Geek Half Human podcast, where we explore the intersections of technology, business, and life. This podcast is powered by Atiba, a custom software and IT services company in Nashville, Tennessee. Now to your hosts, Anna Kate Ross and Joey Baggett.
Hey, everybody. Today, we're going to be speaking with Matt Abbott, who's a data scientist with a background in experimental psychology. He's also an ultra runner and a solo father living in Issaquah, Washington, with his daughter. He recently left Amazon to become a senior data scientist at UltraSignup, an online platform to connect trail and ultra runners with the right race or experience at the right time in their running journey. Today, we're going to find out how Matt uses data to tell stories and develop compelling product experiences, and why he has a penchant for 100-mile races. So welcome, Matt.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to meet you both.
Yes. Well, we're really glad to have you here. This podcast is all about the intersection of business, technology, and life. And we feel like you might epitomize this podcast the best. You're kind of a really neat cross-section in a lot of your background and what you're doing now at UltraSignup. But before we get into too much about that, I want to hear a little bit more about this experimental psychology piece of your background, kind of when you got into the professional world. So you're a data scientist now, but you do have this background in experimental psychology. Can you briefly tell us why you came to have this background? And let's start with the experimental psychology piece.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like many other things I've pursued in life, I just sort of fell into it. So I was in a psychology program at UMass Amherst. I wanted to get involved in research, and I joined the honors program because it had a requirement to do a thesis supported by a research advisor. So that's sort of how it got started. We had a seminar that had a rotation of professors come in and sort of describe their research area, what their lab did. And I had a professor, Adrian Staub, come in one day, present about eye movements in reading. So, where do your eyes go as you're reading words and sentences? We played a random game of Hangman where there was a portion of a sentence preceding some blank letters, and those were all X's. And the point was to highlight how words can be predictable given what precedes them, so in their context. And I remember guessing the word outright, but I was more interested in how our eyes and mind work together to make that possible. So I asked pretty much immediately if he needed a new research assistant, and then I stayed in that field for several years. So that's sort of where that got started.
Yeah, very cool. And so it seems like your natural curiosity in the research and the data that was maybe coming into the research, is that how you ended up moving into data science after that?
So moving into data science is sort of a non-obvious path, and I'll admit that. To sort of lead there, like there is a gap between psychology and data science, and that gap is a lot of skills that you have to develop. So working with eye trackers in particular, so there are these little optical cameras that pick up eye movements as you're going. They record a lot of data. So our tracker is sampled at 1,000 hertz, so there'd be 1,000 data points for every second of activity. Our participants would sit for like 45-minute sessions. So it produces a lot of data points. That's about 2.7 million observations just in that one session. And to do something with that, you have to do a fair amount of data cleaning and processing just to kind of extract meaning from it. And that's all before you begin analysis. And I'd been interested in programming, but I didn't have a good reason or outlet to pick it up before then. My advisor introduced me to R, which is a programming language for working specifically with statistics. And there I could read in, I could process, I could produce summary statistics and models with just a few lines of code. And that was really powerful. Like I remember in stats class, we did some simple t-tests and, means and standard deviations in Excel. But, here was a language that I could use in a very expressive way to automate a lot of the tasks that I was doing. So I kind of got started there. And then I took a computational linguistics course in undergrad, which introduced me to Python, which is, more general purpose programming language. You could do all sorts of cool stuff with it. And I was just hooked. So I found myself using Python to automate tasks that I was doing manually in the lab. And that sort of set the path for the skills that I would develop on the way toward data science. But I didn't start on a path to data science. I was on a path to become a research professor. Like that's what I thought my future was.
Yeah. And when I was first learning more about your background and I was about thinking about the experimental psychology, I think I was making the connection between like research to data analysis and like the psychological inferences you would draw. But the gap that you mentioned is like the technical gap that you had to overcome with like the programming languages you needed to learn and some of these more like technical aspects of data science. I gotcha.
Yep. And I think like data analysis is definitely a critically important part of both research and applied data science. But I think that the difference is often like how do you take the analysis that you're doing but put it in a production environment? And so that's where a lot of those kind of fill the gap skills came in handy later on. I didn't know at the time that it was helping me toward that, but in the end it did.
Yeah, and when you say can you about the production environment, can you say a bit more about that? You mean like, in practice? Like that kind of thing?
So like so at Textio, for example, my first job out of grad school was at a startup that had a natural language processing backend, and so we analyzed job descriptions to figure out what words or phrases you should or shouldn't do to attract the types of candidates that you want to hire. And all of that worked in a live web product. So for me to take the sorts of data work that I was doing and bring it to life in the product, I had to, bring stuff I was doing into production. So I had to learn, how do I edit the code in production to do what I want it to do so that it's borne out in the product. So that's what I mean by in production. Like how do you take these things you're working on and build it into a system such that it proceeds without you? Um, and that's not something that you do typically in psychology. Like, when we're analyzing an experiment, it's very much an offline process. You're doing it. You might do it only once. You might never reuse that script again. Whereas, in technology, it's okay. A user is going to come interact with the site. They have expectations about how it works. It has to be reliable and work the same way every time. And it's just a very different mindset.
I gotcha. So now having the background in experimental psychology, now being a data scientist, what did you think you were gonna be when you grew up?
So
Like when you were a kid?
that's a good question. I asked my mom this question yesterday because I couldn't remember. What did she say? She said I wanted to be a rock star, um, which I did actually pursue for several years. I did that for a while. What I remember was wanting to be an army ranger. I don't know where I got that one from, or I wanted to be an explorer who took photos or videos for National Geographic. Like I was really into animals, and I wanted to go out and go to Borneo and photograph spiders or something.
Well, now having the career that you do have, are you surprised? Are you surprised you ended up here, or does this feel like a pretty good match for kind of who you were as a kid and who you are as an adult?
I'm a little bit surprised, and I think I'm a little surprised because I liked I liked math, and I was pretty good at math as a kid. But in high school and college, I actually really struggled with it, and so I came into data science thinking very much that I was an imposter in this space. Like I never took calculus, I never took linear algebra. I was not somebody who really pursued the upper echelon of math. Um, and so to be in this position at all has always been a little bit surprising to me. But I think it makes sense from the perspective that I like taking a problem from end to end. So I like from conception all the way through to delivery. And I'm an analytical thinker. I pick things apart and try to ask why and figure out what the underlying process is.
Yeah, yeah. Now I'm armchair psycho using my armchair psychology on you, but it seems like, with your curiosity and like the passion that you bring to both running and the analysis of running and the science behind it, it seems like a great fit for your personality.
I agree with that. Today it's like it's my dream job. I'm really lucky to get up every day and come to work to do this.
Yeah, and see that I'll just chime in. So, but before we actually started recording this call, I was telling Matt a little bit about my background. I'm a salesperson. I'm a business development person. I like to talk to people and interact with people. I'm not big on data. I like numbers. I like how they can tell a story. But we've had you're not the first data person we've had on the podcast. We had a guy, Mike Rosen, who his whole thing was taking publicly available data and turning it into money. Yours is taking this data and seeing how it affects the human body and performance, like ultra running. And ultra running is such a fascinating world. And not that it overshadows marathon runners or anything like that, but it is really, really interesting to get into some of their stories, because I feel like every ultra runner I've ever done any research on has such an awesome story about how they got there. So we're talking to you about your story of how you got to be a data scientist, and it's very much, me being a salesperson, like left brain versus right brain. I think that this is such a great topic for the podcast, and I want to dig in a little bit to the ultra running side. So ultra running, for those that may not know or first time listening, is anything longer than your typical marathon of 26.2. I know that there are more even numbers to where you have 50-mile ultra runs, you have 100-mile ultra runs. And some of these runs, we're talking over 24 hours of consistent and constant movement of the body, which I think is what fascinates you from the psychology and the data science perspective of how all that works together. But anyway, so to get started on the ultra side, you mentioned that you'd like to do a lot of hiking and backpacking back a long time ago. You're a single parent and you don't really have the time to date those big elaborate trips. So I guess, how did you get from someone who loved to do the hiking, the trails, to someone who's doing ultra running?
That's a good question. So I guess backing up a bit, I was not an athletic kid. I didn't run as a kid. I played, little league baseball a little bit, but I wasn't very good at it, and I didn't go anywhere. So I sort of set aside any athletic things forever. I wrote it off, figuring that wasn't me. I'd been hiking for a little bit after moving to Washington State. So I've been here for 7 years now, and I saw my friends posting amazing photos on Instagram, and I was like, wow, I have to go to these places. I was like ridiculously out of shape. I was probably 60 pounds heavier than I am now. I could barely go up a flight of stairs without getting winded. And I just started going hiking. So I started off local, progressed to some bigger stuff in the Cascades. And I'd been doing that for like a year before I started getting involved in mountaineering. I wanted to climb the big mountains. I wanted to climb Mount Baker, Mount Rainier. So I learned how to wield an ice axe and, save yourself if you're sliding down a 45-degree glacier. And then everything changed, right? Like all of a sudden my life situation changed, and I didn't have the time that I needed to go do these things. But and the context is important, because I'd only really just gotten into that. So I was like, on a slope of progression, and saw, had all these big dreams of what I wanted to do, but I suddenly didn't have the time or means to do it anymore. But in my backyard here, I have Tiger Mountain. It's not a huge mountain, 3,000 feet, but it's got all sorts of trails, and it's less than a mile from my house. So, I was thinking about it. I was like, well, how do I figure out how to check off all these routes that I want to do in the future? Well, if I only have a day, you speed it up. Can I multiply the speed that I go by 2? Can that allow me to accomplish it in a day? So I set out one day in boots of all things and pants, and I ran up and down the mountain in my backyard. And lo and behold, I didn't hate that experience. I think running in boots is pretty painful, and I didn't know at the time that trail running was even a thing. I didn't know that people ran distances further than marathons. I thought all this seemed pretty novel at the time, which is a great incubator for like exploring new things in life. I think is, when you think you're the first one to do something, it really empowers you to think creatively. But I latched on to one goal. Like I really wanted to climb Mount Olympus on the Olympic Peninsula here in Washington. To climb Mount Olympus, for the most part, you have to go 18 miles out in the rainforest, and then you have to climb a glacier, and you have to rock climb at the end. So it's a really long voyage. Like round trip, it's like 42, 44 miles. And I wanted to do that. That was my North Star. So I started trail running with that in mind, knowing that if I ever wanted to do that in the span of a day, I had to prove to myself certain things. I had to run 20 miles in a day. I'd have to run 26 miles in a day, 30 miles in a day. And so I kept that goal and just kind of progressively increased what I did. Now, I haven't actually done Mount Olympus. It's still on my list, but I've never found the time to do it. It's a 5-hour drive. It's a 24-hour adventure. But keeping that goal in mind has always been what motivated me to do the next big thing.
So would you say that ultimate goal of wanting to climb Mount Olympus is what got you into ultra running? Or is it one of those things that you started running the trails and you're like, hey man, I kind of like this?
I think it was really the that goal, because there was that, but it was the biggest one. Like there were a variety of other things I wanted to do. So the one that I did was it was about a 25-mile route through the Alpine Lakes wilderness here to go up to this lake called Pea Soup Lake on the shoulder of Mount Daniel. Just like super epic place, tall, craggy spires and hanging glaciers, and then this like, turquoise pool of water from glacier melt. And I remembered stumbling upon it online and was like, I have to go there. But I can't run 20 miles. I can't run 24 miles. So let's figure out how to do that.
So do you, I guess when it comes to the trail running, and then eventually, you went from hiking to trail running, at what point in time did that switch kind of flip to say, you know what, like I want to take this beyond just hiking. I want to be more competitive in this. And I guess the better question here is, do you do ultra running as a competitive sport, or do you do it as more of personal goals?
It's a good question. So I guess what flipped the switch in a funny way, what flipped the switch is I was coming back from an overnight backpacking trip, and I was going to meet some friends at a different trailhead to hike in an hour and a half. And I had my full pack on my back, and the only way I was going to get there is if I ran down the mountain. So I did that. uh, and it didn't suck. So I decided to do it more than once. But sorry, what was the other question? I've already forgotten the other question.
Are you more of a competitive ultra runner, or you do it more for just like for fun almost?
Oh, yeah. So I definitely do. I do it for fun, and I do it to accomplish long routes in the scope of a day. Like that's my thesis as a participant in trail running. I joined in races as an experiment of sorts. So it's sort of a funny story. I'd been on a bad first date with somebody who couldn't understand why I would possibly run as much as I do, if not to race. And I was like, well, that opinion doesn't have any value in it, but it really got under my skin. And so I think it was like New Year's Eve or something. I'm sitting at my parents' house in the dead of night. I'm staring at a screen for race registration, and it was it was Tiger Claw in my backyard. So it was a 25-mile race where you run up and down Tiger Mountain 4 times, like absolutely brutal. Like probably to most people sounds awful, but I was like, you know what, that sounds great. Sign me up. But I want to win it. Like, this comment really got under my skin, so I wanted to prove myself that I could do it. So it was an experiment. It worked out okay. I did pretty well in that race, but it's not my reason for doing it. Competing is fun, but it's also like, I don't know. There's a lot of performance pressure. You set an expectation for yourself. If you don't deliver, there's disappointment. There's lots of stuff about it that can shift it into the category of work, which I think a lot about. It's like, do I want to take away the natural enjoyment that I have from this activity that lets me explore spaces in the world? There's like racing, and then there's exploration and adventure over there, and to me they're a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of people would be surprised if they started doing some research into ultra running that it's not, the trails aren't always the trails that you might see at a state park. These trails are intense. They're craggy. There's not a well-defined space. You're working hard. You're not just running easily. So I guess I'm going to ask a question to get your opinion, Matt, and your opinion may differ than a lot of other people, but let's say you have someone who does love to run, and they're more of a road runner type of person, marathons, 5Ks, 10Ks. What would be your advice to someone who says one day, I want to try ultra running? Like, what's a way for them to maybe dip their toe in the water without doing something really intense that would, like a tiger claw running up and down a mountain 4 times? What is a way to get into it without just overwhelming someone?
That's a good question. I think the gateway drug, so to speak, for most people is a 50K. So, if you're coming from a background in marathons and you want to push yourself into the ultra space, a 50K makes sense. It's not that much further than a marathon. I've never run a marathon before, so I wouldn't know. But so that's an option. But there's also, there's a lot of trail races that aren't ultra races too. So I think, like, maybe one misconception about UltraSignup is that because we have ultra in the name, it's all ultra races. But we have a lot of 5Ks and 10Ks and half marathons too. And so I think there's a way to get your feet wet in the trail world without having to dive into the ultra space. And so it might be that actually the best place to start is like a trail 10K or a trail half marathon, something without a ton of elevation, just to get a sense of what it's like. Because I think, like, for people that come from a road background, one immediate hurdle is that because of the variation in terrain, you can't always run the whole time. Like you said, like, there might be a part of a course where you're just scrambling over rocks, and, like, maybe you could run, but it wouldn't be very efficient. And so I think the first thing that you have to do is dispel the notion that you can run a consistent pace the whole time or have negative splits or something like that. It's fully dependent on the course you're running.
Well, and I think that's great, because as someone who just looked into it, and again, I'm fascinated by some of the stories of the trail runners that are out there and the ultra runners that are out there. And I think it's good to know that you don't just have to hop into a 50-mile ultra or a 100-mile ultra to get started. So yeah, but maybe that's something for people to look into. Like, hey, are there some 5Ks, 10Ks, maybe that are more local to you where you don't have to do a big trip? And so I'm sorry, I have 2 more questions, and then Aniket, I promise I'm gonna shut up. I told them both that I'm fascinated about ultra running before this even happened. So one, are you going to encourage your daughter to start doing the ultras?
That's a good question. So we've been trail running together exactly once. So she's 9 years old. She's a second grader, and sorry, she's a third grader. Oh my gosh. Time flies. And, we went on a hike one time, and then she's like, Dad, I want to run down. So we ran down. I guess as a parent, what I don't want to do necessarily is kind of impose my own interests on them, because I know that kids tend to be a little bit resistant to that. So if she shows a natural inclination or interest in it, I will help her get there. But I'm not going to push it on her, because frankly, it's just a hobby. It's a hobby I picked up in my 30s, and I love it, but it's not something I've been doing my whole life. It's not something that I think, like, she's a worse person off if she doesn't do it. But if she says, Dad, I want to run a 50K with you, like, heck yeah, I'm going to do that with her.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. And if you guys, after the show, if you want to go and just, like, peruse Matt's Instagram, there's a lot about his running and with his daughter. It's just really cool to kind of see those pictures and read those the stories. But last question that I have is, you mentioned in the YouTube video that I watched, where you interviewed Riley and a few other ultra runners, that you do have a thing for the 100-mile distance. Could you talk to us a little bit about, like, why the 100-mile is kind of special to you?
That's an interesting one. So I remember distinctly one night watching on Netflix. It was some documentary about the Barkley marathons. I can't remember which one it was. It might have been The Race That Eats Its Young. But I remember, like, in watching that, coming to the realization for the very first time that a human can run 100 miles. Now, granted, finishing Barkley almost never happens. Very, very few people have ever finished it. It's sort of a beast in its own way. But that just blew my mind. Like, before that day, I didn't know that people ran further than marathons. I thought that was the epitome of human performance. So just crazy. But as for me with 100 miles, I wrestle about it a little bit because in many respects, it seems like a rite of passage as an ultra runner, like to run 100 miles. So that's like in one corner. But at the same time, I know it doesn't make me any less of a trail runner if I don't do that. It's not a requirement. You don't have to run 100 miles to be a trail runner. But I like to push myself, right? I like to push myself. I like to realize my potential and what I didn't think I could do before. So last September, I did a 100K route with some friends in the North Cascades, mostly just to prove to myself that I could do it. Since I was thinking about signing up for a 100K race, I was genuinely surprised by how well that day went, and so that it shifted my mental model of what was possible for me as a person. Just that I could get going just before sunrise and cover 62 miles of some pretty epic terrain just after the sun went down was wild. It all seemed crazy. And so it's one of those experiences that I look back to when things in life get hard. It's like, you know what? I did that. I can do pretty much anything. And so 100 miles seems like a pretty logical step after that. So it would be a test to see what I'm capable of. But really, my dream is, going back to mixing all of my interests together. It's that Mount Olympus North Star. It's like, how do I lump in technical climbs with long runs and just like do all these awesome things in a day that people typically take 5 days to do?
That's awesome, man. Thank you for sharing all that. It was really enjoyed hearing it because ultra running is such a cool topic. So, Anna Kate, I'll let you shut me up. I mean, take over now.
Yeah, that was neat to hear about. I always assumed that ultra running was more. I mean, obviously, lots of people do it, and there's different reasons for it. But I assumed competition was like one of the main reasons to go about it. But I liked hearing about how you described it as it's more for you about exploring spaces in the world and having that adventure than it is about like beating someone necessarily, or even just the achievement of getting out ahead of the pack. I'm sure that there are times when that feels really good also, but if the primary goal is just like the exploration, that's really neat. Well, let's tie some of the topics we've talked about together at this point. So you started out in experimental psychology, you've gotten into data science. During that time, you became an ultra runner and got really fascinated by exploring outdoor spaces through ultra running. And now you work at UltraSignup. So describe for us again, what is exactly your role at UltraSignup?
That's a good question. So I think like as with any small company, my role is a little ambiguous and shifts day to day. But I think like largely speaking, I own the space of data and how it's represented. So if there's a question about is our runner rank the right runner rank, how do we represent where somebody places in a race on the site? Like we have a rank that gives you a score it's basically a percentage of the fastest time out of everyone else's time. Is that the right way to do it? Is averaging that to produce a rank the right way to surface the right people? So there's questions like that, but there's also questions like, how do you recommend the right race to someone at the right time? Like, say they just finished a 50K, what race should they do next? So I think there's things like that to sort of build into the product space. But then there's also business stuff. We do some survey research on the side, and so there's some aggregation and creating of charts, and figuring out answers to basic business questions using data. So essentially, like anything that deals with data and how to extract meaning from it would fall onto my plate.
Okay, gotcha. And before we get too far into that, it's worth noting that you came to UltraSignup from Amazon. So your data science career evolved from the research role you had early on into some pretty cool places like Amazon. And you were there for 3 years, I think, right?
Yep. I did 3 years there in a variety of different HR spaces. So I started off working in their HR contact center, helping them figure out why people were calling them, basically. And then shifted into the DEI space before I left.
Got it. Okay. So one of the other roles that you play at UltraSignup also is UltraSignup has a couple of podcasts, and we'll link the YouTube channel in the show notes so folks can take a peek at that. But the UltraData podcast that you drive is partially, or at least to me, it seems is to tell the story of a run. So there will be maybe an interesting run that's happened, and you'll look at the data associated with that run and try to pick out some of the storylines that wouldn't have been obvious otherwise. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, and I guess to be honest, it sort of evolved as an idea that came up in a company meeting. I think it's because I was wearing these headphones and I had this microphone in front of me, and it was like, oh wow, Matt's all set up to do a podcast. Maybe you should do a podcast. It was an interest that I had before coming into UltraSignup, but didn't have a reason to do it. And I think the evolution of it was pretty freeform. I think unlike many jobs I've ever had, I have a lot of freedom here to pick, the direction that I think is the right one for me to go down. And so I wasn't really given any specific directive. It was just, hey, it would be cool if you made a podcast about data. And so at first I settled on wanting to come up with a method for determining how difficult a race is, because it had product value too. So we wanted to feed it back into our product to get people excited about running these different races. And it gave me an opportunity to reach out to different people and just talk to them about their running career. Like what do they think makes a race hard to them? What are the hardest races that they've run? And it just kind of evolved from there. Like, frankly, it wasn't something I really knew how to do. I'd picked up bits and pieces of audio and video engineering over the years, but I'd never merged it all together. So it was a fun experiment, and like most other fun experiments in life that I've done, I'm surprised that it worked out, but the reception's been pretty good.
And the first episode. So you looked at the time data that you had from the race, and then were able to interview a couple of the racers and present. And what it seemed to me is that you were presenting your analysis of what sounded like was happening at various parts of the race, given what you knew about the terrain and where they were in the race at that time, and then ask for their anecdotal feedback on what was happening in your mind when that was happening. Does this sound right? Is this not right?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so we're talking about episode 2. I can shift into that one. Yeah. So how did this start? This started as a recognition that, okay, so backing up a bit, when you go to ultrasignup.com and you go to a results page and it shows you a table of, who placed first, second, third, what their time was, whatnot. That data all comes in from an uploaded file. Like somebody uploads a file and it gets there. But that was about the level of granularity that we had. And I knew that, in this, watch that I'm wearing, it records all sorts of stuff that's deeper than just what that finishing time was. And so we knew as a company, if we wanted to go down the direction of telling deeper stories with data and presenting deeper analytics, like if you wanted to show how long somebody spent in an aid station during a race and have that available in a chart on their profile or something like that. I don't know, just a random example. You couldn't do that using the data we had. We had to get more data. And so then the question became, well, how do we get people to give data from their watches? And so we had a race that was coming up, Javelina 100, so big 100-mile race in Arizona in October. And so we said, okay, let's email people. We'll ask them to send us their data. We'll give them an upload portal, and then they can send it to us in that way. And so the sort of mechanism for that podcast episode started there with that data collection exercise, just to collect the data to tell a deeper story. And then there was a lot of data science stuff that I had to do after that, which was, how do I process the raw samples from this watch to tell a story? How do I know where someone is at different points in time? How do I know how fast they were going? And what I found going through it was what looked like a lot of interesting stories, but they needed validation because I wasn't there in the race with them. How do I know that this coordinate telling me, if I compare 2 data files, that this person passed this other person then? Do I know that's real? How do I know that's real without video footage or without asking them? So that's where the interview came in, which was, I actually have to talk to these people and I have to cross-reference their stories and validate them to know that this is what happened on race day.
Gotcha. And did you, speaking about the episode with the Javelina 100, that is the one that I watched. Did you have hypotheses going into it, or was it more like once you had analyzed the data that you got access to, you had a bunch of mini hypotheses, and that was what was validated by the interviews, or speak a little bit about that process?
That's a great question. So I think anytime you're working with data, especially data that you're unfamiliar with, it's an even mixture of like confirming expectations about what you think you're going to see, and then being completely surprised by what you find that flies in the face of those expectations. And so I didn't have a whole lot of expectation going in. From my own experience, I knew that there can be races where there's someone leading the pack and they're 35 to 40 minutes ahead of everybody, and nobody passes that person. They just run with it the whole time, and that's it. But I'd seen from other race data finishing times that were really close together, which suggested to me that probably there is some leapfrogging that happens throughout the course. But I'd never seen that before. Like if you go to Strava or something, if a bunch of runners upload their data to Strava, they all have it in race mode and whatnot, and they overlapped sufficiently, you can sometimes piece that together. But I hadn't seen anywhere a way that helped me connect the dots to see what happened. So I didn't really have many hypotheses going into it. And I think what I found was a little bit surprising. Like, I think I expected to see that the elites in the field did something very different than the sort of average Joes like me. And so I did get data from the front of the pack and the mid of the pack so that I could compare those. And what was actually the most surprising to me was just how similar it all looked, right? The elites aren't really doing anything different. They're just doing it faster. It's like you turn a knob to change the resolution on the image and, things just get a little bit tighter, but they do all the same stuff. Like they power hike hills occasionally. They get held up for 15 minutes at an aid station. They have to resolve muscle cramps. Like everybody's doing the same thing. Just some people do it faster than others. And maybe that shouldn't have surprised me, but it did when I first wrapped my head around it.
Yeah, it's almost like pulling back the curtain a little bit to see these ultra racers who you maybe put on a certain pedestal. They're sort of just like us. I mean, they're all kind of doing the same thing, but I would have had a similar hypothesis, I think, is that there was maybe some sort of magic happening or something really special happening, but maybe it was probably kind of humbling for them, that it's really just the same experience that most racers have.
Yeah, and I think like to give some credence to that, in my research, the winner of that race was Dakota Jones, who's really really powerful, strong runner, and I looked up his Strava page for that race, and the way he described it to me was just fascinating. He basically said like, I went out with a fast pace, I went out too strong, and I didn't think there was any way I could hold it, but somehow I did. And that's a story that it really resonates with me. It's like, yeah, you can take a chance on something really big, and sometimes it just works out that way. I think there's a lot behind that. Like his training is really strong. He's an extremely strong and gifted runner, but that anecdote was just amazing to me. And you hear that a lot, I feel like.
I would think that would give newer runners to the space hope, that this is, we're all kind of, it's like an equalizer, everyone's sort of on the same page with this.
Yep. And I think that's something that's truly amazing about ultra running as a sport, is that it's an open sport in that you're competing in the same field as the pros. The playing field is sort of level in that way. Everybody gets a shot. Everybody goes to the same aid stations and receives the same food and electrolytes and whatnot. And like you're all in it together. It's not like baseball where it's like, yeah, to be on the team, you have to do X, Y, and Z and get a contract and whatnot. Like it's not like that at all.
It's more of a community, it seems like.
Exactly.
Yeah. Something that surprised me just as you were talking that I was thinking about was I would have assumed that for these races, ultra races or just regular running road races, that there was more data available. But when you were describing, there's just a file upload with finishing times to, kind of rank people. That's one of the data sets. Then there are these other data sets from watches and, I'm not sure where the other data sets would even come from, but do you feel a little bit like you're like a pioneer in this field, like figuring out how to layer all these data sources on top of each other to tell this story?
Exactly. And I'm trying to find where in my notes I wrote this down, because I wrote down a note that I really liked about how I wanted to tell it. Anyway, I can't find it, but it's sort of like, imagine you're there at the beginning of the sport of baseball, and you're at a time where there's no concept of a batting average. There's no ERA, there's no RBIs. And that's sort of where we are in the sport today, is like we're at a phase where growth is really nascent, and there's steps that you would take to sort of bring it to a more mature space than it is right now. And I think part of that stuff, like broadcasting, like how do you bring in spectators from the outside? How do you make it real in a sense, and tangible, like moving away from like historically ultra running is a sport where you have a race, and then results might come 5 days later, so you might be left for a while waiting. That time crunch is sort of going away. But also, like, on the stats side, how do you frame things in a way that someone can understand what happened at a deeper level? So like if you go to a race page, for example, you might be able to compute someone's average pace. They ran 8 minutes a mile. Great. But this course had 16,000 feet of elevation. You're going up and down mountains. You know that they're climbing at some speed. They're descending at some speed. Their flat ground speed is something else. And so you can imagine there's just a lot of space for refinement in how you present data, so that somebody can understand why someone did better than someone else. Maybe Dakota Jones won Javelina because his climbing speed was twice as fast as the fourth place finisher, or something like that. He's climbing at 9 minutes a mile instead of 14 minutes a mile. And those sort of minute differences matter. But today, if we just look at a finishing time, we don't know that.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, at this point, is there anything else that you wanted to share about UltraSignup, and just kind of where you're planning to take the programs that you're working on, or just about the company itself? Any parting words about UltraSignup?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think we're at a really exciting space. So we have a big vision for where we want to go, how we want to make the platform more social, more data rich, and I guess what I would say is that I'm just so glad we have a strong community that's on board with what we want to do, and that they're patient with us in the amount of time that it takes to get there. I think that what people were, sort of afraid about in the past few years when UltraSignup changed hands is that we would lose our customer obsession a little bit, and our ability just to deliver people in the way that they need. And I guess what I would want to say is that that's not going away. We're just trying to find ways to build on top of it and make all that goodness better for them. And yeah, there, lots of things that we want to do. I want to build out better data displays and dashboards so that people can understand their performance relative to the competition, so that RDs know what their tasks are at different times. They can know how their business is running in a deeper sense. And yeah, just really excited about where we're going. And then you should check out the UltraData podcast if you haven't. It gives me more motivation to keep making it. Yeah, it's a fun ride, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we will make sure to drop the UltraSignup website in the show notes, as well as the YouTube channel you mentioned with the link to the UltraData podcast, and also the Trailhead podcast that UltraSignup offers. And Matt, thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Half Geek Half Human podcast. Make sure to follow the Half Geek Half Human podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Half Geek Half Human.